It's great to see everybody tonight. It's a real honor to introduce Jesse tonight. Before I offer some personal remarks, a few announcements. Next lecture, the upcoming lecture, is Catherine Opie. She is lecturing next on Monday, the 23rd, at 6:30 in the cafe. She's, as you know, an incredibly well-known photographer and artist and a member of the School of the Arts and Architecture. Fred Fisher will lecture on January 30th. That's also Monday. He's, as you may know, a distinguished alumni of the AUD. That'll also be 6:30 in the D Cafe. Jesse, Reiser, and Nanako Umemoto make up Reiser Umemoto, and they're based in New York. And you know probably about their recent projects. 014 is their first major project, 22 stories, completed a couple of years ago in Dubai. I actually had the pleasure of seeing it on. For anybody who's been to Dubai, it's always a bizarre trip and a bizarre world. And Jesse's building there represents a kind of opposite attraction. Jesse's beautiful project and a bizarre, perverse world somehow coexisting. It's definitely worth a trip to see both for different types of emotions. And in the words of Jesse himself, lightning struck twice when they won 2 competitions back-to-back in Taiwan. The first was the Taipei Pop Music Center, which you all know, and the Kaohsiung Port Terminal followed after that. And I think we were also joking that now it was time to stop doing the competitions because you couldn't do it 3 times in a row. But we were waiting for the next one. 014 actually is being documented in a book to be published by the AA, and that'll be out in May, and that includes text by Sylvia Lavin and Jeff Kipnis, so look out for that. I first met Jesse in New York in 1985, where I was living after graduate school at GSD, and Jesse had also finished grad school at Cranbrook, studying with Daniel Libeskind. And a number of Cooper Union graduates, where Jesse went to undergraduate school, got together and kind of threw me in as the odd person out to do a project called the London Project, and we met downtown every week for quite a while discussing work. And I always found the Cooper kids pretty mysterious, I have to say. I lived around the corner from Cooper Union on First Avenue, and in all the 5 years I lived in New York, I got to go into Cooper one time. So it's got to be a pretty mysterious place if you can't get in. We always wondered what went on, and through people like Jesse and our colleague Stan Allen, we sort of had an idea. But as friendly and affable and nice as Stan and Jesse always were, they were still mysterious guys, because they studied with mysterious people like John Hejduk and Daniel Libeskind, and that's still, I think, a powerful context for Jesse's work. For the London project, he was working with Nanako on ideas coming out of Duchamp. And by the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, was pushing that work to pretty extreme levels with incredible collage projects. And if you followed their work, a series of major competitions in the 90s ensued: the Cardiff Opera House, the Yokohama Port Terminal, and I think really one of my favorite projects is the Kansai Library, which was for me a kind of apotheosis in 1996 of a kind of Deleuzian project. I don't know, the idea of the oceanic kind of appeared, and the idea of a kind of striated rigor also appeared in the rewriting and the rereading kind of intelligently extracting Thousand Plateaus. It was really amazing. I know it influenced what I did, and it was pretty powerful. We can kind of fast forward at one level, and I can ask you a question. You know that there is not anyone who doesn't own a copy of Atlas of Novel Tectonics. You own it, and I know you have it, and you keep it under your bed, and you pull it out and you read it because it's so rich. To me, it represents Jesse as a polymath, as a polymathic person, and if you know that term, you know that it means it's a person who's an expert in various subject areas. It doesn't mean that Jesse practices anything other than architecture, but it seems like he does in that book. The modernist canon of architecture, in particular the Miesian grid, a Vickers Wellington fuselage, a Campagnolo break. How do all of those come together in some sort of coherent way? Only he could construct that. To me, I think, in terms of this idea, the polymathic, I would say Jesse's work is extrinsically mysterious, but intrinsically polymathic. And inside, there's incredible complexity. Outside, it's still mysterious. You're still mysterious. You'll always be mysterious. And I don't think there's anything better than that. So please welcome Jesse Reiser.
Each other a really long time. And we were saying, most of the students here weren't even born when we were doing the London Project. Suddenly feel like old men. Yeah, it's great to be here. I mean, I feel, coming out of teaching at Princeton for the past decade, that UCLA in particular, the whole design culture here, at least from the outside, appears so coherent and so focused and so very different from what's going on the East Coast. That I'm always envious and always delighted to come back, for Rumbles and for all of the events, because I feel like it's the old home week, so to speak. But I want to talk tonight about the projects that Neil mentioned, which are the most current in our office, the O14 Tower, and then the Kaohsiung Port Terminal, and the Taipei Pop Music Center. And I wanted to frame them around a very kind of peculiar condition that I think faces many of us now, working internationally, and that is, the question of the propriety of work that we do, which is essentially, in a kind of Deleuzian terms, a deterritorialized project, a project that is very hesitant about trying to connect to the obvious forms of local tradition, and yet at the same time has to confront, I would say, in a very real way, the cultural conditions that those projects are projected into. So much of the work, and I would say the common denominator of the work that I'm going to show tonight, are attempts to deal with that problem, not through normal contextualism, but to hearken back to some of the issues that I, and really we as a group, and I would include the whole of the UCLA community here, because I think that there's a larger project involved, that I would still contend that the work being done, for the most part, is an extension of modernism. But it isn't the international style modernism, but rather the work in general attempts to deal with difference, attempts to deal with the issue of what I would call almost a kind of contradiction, ubiquitous difference. In other words, that we at this point have such powerful tools at hand that can both crunch numbers, can do complex geometry, can read statistics and all of those things, and factor them into an architecture that it's possible now to, in a sense, untether the project from any particular local reading and to produce a kind of contextualism that is at once particular but also universal in its ambition. So I was just talking to Kipnis about this. So he, has coined it as a kind of cosmopolitanism. So not just peculiar to us, but I think in effect, even if you're not aware of it, the implications take in a much wider group of practitioners. So I'm going to try to talk about how that interest works on the projects that we've been involved with over the past, say, 3 years. These are the four projects. I'll only touch on the Shenzhen Airport project, which is a regression off of 014. But they're, in very different circumstances. Of course, 014 is in Dubai. The Shenzhen Airport is in mainland China near Hong Kong. The two projects we won in competition a year and a half ago, Taipei Pop, is characterized in terms of its ambitions, the ambitions of its the programmers, to be a project that doesn't relate just to Taiwan, but attempts to really project its image and its presence across all of Asia. They are particularly threatened by the kind of rise of pop music industry in mainland China. And so the kind of explicit intent of the project is that form of projection. And of course the Kaohsiung Port Terminal connects back maybe to a more traditional notion of maritime infrastructure. That is to say, an architecture that sits on the border between land and water and in a way partakes of the global systems of shipping and is at once part of the city, but it also connects to wider extended systems of transport and exchange. So first with Dubai. Dubai, of course, is the most extreme case. And I'm showing this chart just to indicate, how far-flung the design team was. Really, Dubai becomes the nexus of all of the kind of specialists and consultants, and aside from the general contractor, all of the other expertise really comes from other places around the world. And of course, Dubai, is already very well known, as being, a city, and a kind of instant city, a project in motion. Just the radical shift in the face of that city from 1991 to 2005. And we, of course, were swept up in it. We were very fortunate to have gotten involved in a competition for one of the large iconic buildings that I'll be showing in a second. But the whole way in which this city has been planned, again, remotely through large corporate firms like Halcrow from London, that the notion of a themed sub-city has taken over from any notion of a traditional city, a traditional center. And so you get, highly themed, specific little sub-cities, really islands in the shore, each of which has its own particular kind of circumscribed infrastructure and very separate from one another. So these kind of dominant themed cities, and this was the master plan generated by Halcrow, their rendering, that we were to propose this first iconic central tower. And so in the center of that kind of ring of hell there, we were to propose an 84-story multi-use tower. This was the reality of the site. There were no real buildings at all at that point. That little kind of red flag was the kind of center point of the tower. Never was built. But the other thing I would want to say about this kind of project is that I would hate to sort of read Dubai as particularly unique, but it's really characteristic of a whole series of cities that have grown so quickly, and that their similarities are greater, I would say, than their differences. So that gives occasion for the production of another way of thinking about an architecture for these places, whether you call it cosmopolitan or international or what have you. It wouldn't necessarily, and would almost appear even more inauthentic to try to relate to local culture. It is the culture. It is the culture now, which is not so tethered to place. Anyway, this was the competition entry in the center by Rem Koolhaas, and he did his best to try to figure out what all the competitors would do. And so the United Architects Tower, that's high grade, on the left, was what he basically figured we would generate for the project. But his kind of modus there was really clear. He was posing a kind of modernist severe prism. It did pirouette, it did spin around, but it was basically supposed to be an anti-form argument against all of the kind of extreme architecture calisthenics that he expected to be produced and would emerge in Business Bay. And so, yeah, I mean, it harkens back to a very old way of projecting an architecture. Mises Adam Building and almost all of Mises projects in Germany at that time proposed these kinds of severe prisms, in that case against a 19th century context. But we weren't interested in doing that kind of project. Instead, we were trying to find another way of actually making another kind of iconic building, because the iconic project was something that was explicitly demanded in this competition. We weren't against that idea at all, but we just felt that obviously the idea of an iconic tower and the ones that you see in Dubai are so cliche-laden that it would be important to try to explore some other vector of development than the usual. So what we got interested in, and this is a bit of a dramatized slide, I'll admit, was when you look at the skyline, not to do the normal frame building with the stratified layers and the obvious sort of relationship of bottom, middle, top, but to try to deal with some other way of articulating that zone between ground and sky in the skyline. And so the long view of the building was very important, as was another thing that was really a given was the issue of developer pressure. And so looking back at Colin Rowe's fantastic essay, Chicago Frame, one of the kind of quotes that he puts out was that the architects accepted the conditions by the speculator, and we certainly did. But the conditions have radically shifted, in Dubai of the 2006 versus 19th century Chicago. So it wasn't about putting up the most minimal frame and getting the most out of all the square footage, the most efficient building. These buildings inherently were, in a sense, loss leaders. The iconic trumped any issue of efficiency, or was the efficiency expected? And so we were given a tremendous amount of latitude. The building couldn't be inefficient, but it wasn't ultimately, the kind of criteria that the developer judged the project on. The other thing that happens in Dubai at the urban level is the kind of almost reflexive use of certain kinds of building types, the tower type, and then the creation of a back street, a back building with basically a kind of podium that the building perches on and extends behind for parking. So you get an active frontage for these towers along Sheikh Zayed Road here, and then a completely dead back street, occupied by parking structures. And we had to work within really severe kind of sub-postmodern constraints that were set up by this kind of British planning firm, Halcrow. So they included the podium base with active frontage, a double-height arcade, and then this provision for parking in the podium. So working with the developer, we basically tried to overturn or to modify those rigid strictures. So instead of just one level, we proposed, although this was something that really, we proposed multiple levels of activity in the building. That would assume that the buildings and the podia could be linked together. That ultimately didn't happen, so our building is a kind of little segment of the ambition. So there's a utopian dimension to the project in that if the development were created correctly, you could actually get an active ground plane and an active elevated podium level as well. So that's part of the project. The arcade in this case was reread as part of the kind of exoskeleton shell. Not an applique, but really kind of inherently a part of what happens if we separate the exoskeleton from the lobby and make it porous. And then also addressed, actually at a purely pragmatic level, the issue of stuffing the podium with parking. Because the building was actually on a very prominent site next to the water, it didn't take too much convincing to argue the developer that he should program those spaces and put all of the parking below grade. So this diagram basically illustrates most of the issues that we were working with. This elevated podium, opening the ground plane up, a very modernist sort of move, so the podium itself, instead of going all the way to ground, as is typical in loading with parking, you super elevated that, so it's higher than the lever house podium, and really made it a kind of gateway from the back street to the waterfront esplanade. Okay, I'm going to digress for a second. This has nothing to do with the 014 project, but it is an important issue for me. And that hinges on the issue of aesthetics and performance. I am a lover of bicycle parts obsessively. And one of the things that I found really interesting, I was just attracted to these things. I remember being so attractive that my teeth hurt. This came out in the late 80s, the one on the left. The one on the right I can't stand, and I'll tell you why in a second. But the one on the left, which is a crank set, which was part of the C record grupo that Campagnolo did, came at a point when the computer was just being introduced in manufacturing. And Campagnolo still had his old team of tool and die makers. It was very equivalent in a way to the situation at Peter Eisenman's office that Greg talks about, where he wanted to do drawings that looked like a computer did them, but didn't have the computers yet. They were under pressure from the Japanese companies that did have them, but he had incredibly skilled, tool and die people and draftsmen, so they drew as if a computer did that work, but brought all of that sensibility and all of that knowledge to the making of parts to this work. And so what resulted was just an exquisite series of pieces, of components that collectors really vie for even today. So they recognize there's something about it. And I think for us, just in terms of kind of aesthetic sensibility, I almost feel like, and this is really kind of sacrilege too, that in a certain sense, aesthetics might reach an apogee at a certain moment in time that can be unsurpassed, and that one can recognize that. And it's really probably a very reactionary position to take, but the Grupo on the right, which is actually done with all of the, they're now completely computerized. They're able to analyze all the stresses on the carbon fiber and lay them up and do all of that. But the end of the day, from the purely aesthetic dimension, I would say that's a kind of a loss rather than a gain. And so I think when it comes to architecture, that's a really interesting problem. Of course, it's not going to fly in bicycle racing because the crank set on the right is going to win the races. But in architecture, performance, I would contend, shifts to the object on the left. Anyway, that's my harangue, and I will get back to the rest of the presentation on overheat. So, one of the other things that I think is really interesting in the project, and when we're sort of speculating on the project, comes from what has happened in terms of the relationship between production now and production as it was once sort of framed by people like Walter Benjamin. And so Benjamin talks about the mountain as being kind of quintessentially of a place, unique, original, and unmovable. And it produces the effect of a distance. And I realized that now we're able actually to produce those kinds of effects in a way to, using kind of Deleuzian terminology, you get a deterritorialized presence that really is very ambiguous, very hard to place, certainly not a rooted presence, but partakes of those effects of a distance that were formerly a part of nature. And the other thing that is clear in the new modalities, and others have written about this far more eloquently than I, is the fact that there are no more originals, that almost all of us are working iteratively. And that has a real impact on how we understand context. So I bring up these two figures, two comedians, as illustrations. One, the Zelig model, and Zelig, of course, is the quintessential shapeshifter. He becomes anything he's close to. So that would be the old contextualism, I would say. And you see that in these kinds of projects where there's an attempt to sort of update traditional culture, crossing high-tech and traditional culture together. What we're really interested in is another comedic figure, the Chauncey Gardner model, or as Jeff Kipnis corrected me, his name isn't Chauncey, it's actually Chance, and Chauncey is only one sort of manifestation of the Chance Gardner. And so he's characterized as being dumb as a post by the maid. What everybody reads deep meaning into him. They're basically, he's a revealer of the context rather than the other way around. So with 014, just in the way it's been received, people have interpreted basket weaving as part of the process, and I don't deny it. In a way, I think the minor arts do kind of enter into this kind of work, but one could also say that probably those minor arts were, in a sense, an early kind of cosmopolitan structure. They're sort of everywhere and nowhere. Everybody has baskets in all cultures, crosses them. Not new, but very old. And equally, at the level of interpretation, you know, people have compared it to cheese or laundry baskets. Russians are absolutely convinced that it came from Melnikov's house. So it's a really interesting territory because it's very cagey. And intentionality, in a way, has very little to do with it, what I think. It's more that it's out there, and it resonates in ways that are really uncontrollable. So this is the interior of the Melnikov house, and then part of 014 interior and construction on the right. And of course, there are completely uncontrolled interpretations. And so really the building became planimetrically very simple, a kind of soft cruciform structure, an exoskeleton about 1 meter away from the floor plate. So the exoskeleton does all the work of, you know, holding the floors up. There are no interior columns. And because it's such a robust structure like a reactor cooling tower, the core could also be much lighter because the exoskeleton takes all of the lateral forces that are normally taken by the core. And the building evolved from being more of a typical column frame building. It was also mixed use at the beginning, so there was residential in the deep cruciform, and then it bellied out to office in the first iterations. And the market changed. There was a redesign in terms of the kind of programmatic demand, and then it became only office. And again, looking back at Rose's article on Chicago Frame, I was particularly struck by one of the digressions when he talks about the anti-frame, which is the Frank Lloyd Wright St. Mark's Tower. And in a sense, and again, this is kind of retrospective analysis, the 014 project is sort of the inverse of the Wright project. That the Wright project has a very strong central core that carries the building, cantilevers out, and has these spinning trays. Our building takes that kind of central core and expands it out, and then the slabs hang within. But it is related, I would say. It's probably the closest project I can think of in the lineage, away from the frame. And then this is notionally what happened in the project. The columns migrate out to the surface, become an exoskeleton. And there were very interesting moments, too, when working through the changes in thickness of the exoskeleton, where the shell changes thickness abruptly above the podium. So we had to find ways of detailing the openings that crossed over that transition zone, created a kind of reveal, which maybe in some of the photographs you can see them in this isometric, that basically overlapped the two different shell thicknesses. And as a consequence, I would say, of the use of the exoskeleton, we found that it induced the chimney effect. So after talking with a mechanical engineer and adjusting the number of connections and the thickness of the connections, we were told that you could achieve a 30% reduction in cooling costs. But that was really a kind of byproduct of other interests and other agendas rather than a kind of explicit thing that we focused in the beginning. And that sort of leads me to another, I don't know if it's a harangue, but it's something that I think is really important to think about. I realize that this is something that was really troubling me for a long time. The issue of sustainability and how we, in our profession, deal with that. And I realized that at one level, the purely quantifiable aspects are fairly free of the architectural content. In other words, both of these buildings have LEED Platinum ratings. They both perform on a purely numerical level the same, and their forms couldn't be different. So if Tom wants to represent sustainability, that's fine, but it's really not necessary. It could be anything. When it's purely based on a performance criteria, which I would say is a liberating condition. And I thank God there's no sustainable style. Not to say that we don't and must kind of follow those constraints, but they really are fairly neutral relative to architecture. This doesn't work. The other thing that we were really kind of working on in terms of the detailed design of the form of the building is that we would finally weren't going to be so much involved in complex form, but that all of the complexity would reside in the pattern. So I was looking at two kind of contrasting models and trying to put them together. One is a kind of featureless monolith, and I was really struck by the pyramid of Cestius in Rome when I was there, that you really couldn't tell how big it was because it had no features on it at all. So in the mist, it could either look gigantic, or when you got up to it, it was actually shockingly miniature. And then on the other side, a kind of figure that has excessive features, a disruptive camouflage pattern. And to bring those two models together was really our interest. I'm going to the wrong. I think I'm going to a completely wrong animation. I don't know how this skipped. Well, I think I'm going to need some technical assistance here for something that I've juggled. So that's way at the end. I want to go back. Keep going. Keep going. Up. Up. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Very fluent in PowerPoint. But one of the things that we started to play around with, because it is a diagrid structure, was to try to defeat readings of height. And we realized that in a normative diagrid, you get the slabs to line up with the crossing points. And so we deliberately kind of put those out of phase, and it becomes very difficult to read the floor levels as a result. And there are even blogs that attempt to try to kind of compare and contrast and figure out those things. So we were successful. Worked through a lot of different iterations. Also here, the goal was to try to defeat obvious kind of flow lines through the diagrid to track the actual kind of pattern of flow that would sort of follow in and along the diagrid. So we got a series of kind of discontinuous kind of cusps that could transmit the forces sufficiently, but didn't read as a kind of an emphasis of the diagrid. So there's an unrolled elevation of that. You can see all of the dashed lines are the connections to the slab. So they're really almost random. They have a very different set of dimensions. And another thing that was important in producing this facade was the kind of up-close experience. So very different from the kind of one-point perspective that you would get in a typically gridded curtain wall situation, but that you get kind of different speeds of diminution and expansion in the facade, rather than kind of focusing in on one. And it also resonated with some of the stuff I saw as a kid, The Sea of Holes and Yellow Submarine, where up and down, side to side becomes very ambiguous. So in certain aspects, you get that kind of effect. The other thing was the issue of the office space itself, and the question of how the office might be occupied in a spec office building. This would be, I guess, the analog to modernist notion of this George Tooker painting, and the regimentation of people and of materials determined by the presence of paper and filing, and people are filed the way paper is and all of the equipment. But as that material becomes lighter and lighter, there's the opportunity to really radically rethink the way the office might be inhabited. So these are speculations, really, and since a building persists over time, the hope is that there would be a much freer way of using this space, depending upon whether you want to be close to a lighter zone or a darker zone, and how you would lay claim to a space when you have technologies that are light and allow you to be flexible and not fixed to a certain part of the office. And so there's also the more concrete set of effects that operate too. Because of this diagrid being a meter away, you don't have a kind of reinforced horizon like in the gridded buildings, but are able to get strange oblique views up and down and to the side, past the level of the slab lines. And another thing that I think is not just characteristic of 014, but I think will be increasingly a part of the built world, is the strangeness, the kind of, how do you say, kind of uncanny connection between the renderings and the finished building. So the rendering is on the left. The building acquires a really strong materiality during construction, and then when it was finally finished, and in this case it had to be painted, it really looked like a built rendering. So I think that's something that we see increasingly in buildings of this type. The other thing, which is more kind of deeply material, has to do with the way we were thinking through homogeneity and heterogeneity in the construction and the makeup of the construction. And the analysis on the left was actually done by Guy Nordenson's students on the Les Robertson design for the World Trade Center. Apparently, there were 14 different alloys used in the steel in the Trade Center in order to keep all of the members exactly the same. And I realized that the sort of driving force behind the 014 project was kind of connected in a spectrum to that, but on the other side of the spectrum. So we were really trying to get as much heterogeneity as possible. What that meant was not really changing so much the strengths, but we would have to work with the redundancy of the construction itself, that we upped the PSI of the concrete as high as it could go, and that gave us the greatest flexibility in size and density of the pattern. And that, again, is connected to the Robertson model, but it's towards completely different formal and effective ends. I'd also like to say, just in terms of the way we do projects in the office, we don't restart our projects from zero, but try to take material that we've been thinking and working through and then apply them in a different way. So this is our proposal for Shenzhen Airport. I won't talk too much about it, but in effect it's the development of the 014 model on its side, but upping the ante. So instead of completely perpendicular cuts in the normal to the shell, we began to explore the idea of varying the sectional cut. essentially keeping the outer fenestration completely regular. So the cladding and the glazing would be regular, but everything behind it would shift. And that would produce a whole series of atmospheric effects in the vault. And you get a kind of a virtual form emerging. Almost look lumpy or irregular, but actually had a completely uniform cross-section. But here are the glazing panels, kind of just demonstrating that the outer surface is regular, and you work with the sectional variation. And that then also connected to different agendas, whether we were putting fenestration in laterally or on the top of the vault. So people traveling on the travelators could get glimpses of, there would be a kind of periodic use of holes angled towards gates that you could see from the travelator, and then another pattern agenda for the roof, which was much more atmospheric. And we also experimented to reintroduce kind of massive columns to kind of direct people in the space and really make a really plastic sense of the space. Not to do clear free spans anymore, but to really explore the issue of the column. In terms of fabrication, I'm jumping all around here, of O14, we originally had rubber molds that could be reused. That was dispensed with by the contractor, and we instead used foam molds that were, automatically cut, automated wire cutters, and they were waste molds. So they would pour the concrete around the opening, and then they were smashed out with hammers. And the building was a kind of learning experience, well, certainly for us, but also for the contractor, because there were no clear precedents about how to deal with placement of formwork and efficiency. So this was one of the early shots when they were placing formwork basically up in the diagrid and using transits to level them and so forth. They finally came up with a much more straightforward projection method, where they basically had blown up images of the pattern, unfolded pattern on the shuttering, and then they placed them directly. And this is just a view from the top of the building when the shell kind of emerges free. And ridges that connect the podium move through the shell, from the podium through the shell to the office space. And again, that gap in the lobby space. And one of those views between the glazing and the shell, and the ability to kind of look up into that space. The reception desk, it took longer to design that than the building. And then a view from the back, so you see the kind of podium wrapping the back of the elevated podium, super truss that allows for the cantilever. Okay, I'll move on to the Taipei Pop Music Center. As I mentioned, it was a competition held about a year and a half ago, and it was motivated by this perception that the music industry in Taiwan, while it was really the originator of pop music, actually in all of Asia, was rapidly being kind of overcome by burgeoning industry in mainland China. So they want to finally give an identity, a place for the production of Taiwanese and Asian pop in the city of Taipei, and they really wanted to create a new kind of precinct in the city that would do that. So the site is actually two sites, a very difficult kind of connection of two sites, one across this Xinsheng Road corridor, a very long site, and then this more rectilinear site, and then it's bracketed by two major subway stops. It's right now an industrial area. So our idea was to create not only the buildings, but to create this precinct that would actually bridge across the road, create a new elevated ground. So it would be, both connected to the city, but would clearly also be a very different experience once you ascended to that new plane and then encountered the different programmatic elements of the project. So there was a call for a major auditorium for 4,000 people, an office building that would house the music industry, and so our solution was actually to combine those two, and then a major hall of fame, and at that point a completely outdoor performance space for 14,000 people. So it's a landscape, it's a landform design as well as the design of object buildings. So that cube on the left contains the Hall of Fame, and then carved into the face of it is seating for 450 people to look out over the complex to see the events, and also for Hall of Fame induction ceremonies and so forth. And the idea that we kind of started the project was the thought that we didn't want a stadium, which would be a completely closed organism, really separate from the city, but some form of a modified circus scheme, where we would, instead of closing the ends off, we would open the ends to the city, and one would gradually rise up, and then that simple circus axis would branch off and connect to the adjoining site that would have the auditorium on it. So the main circus form was for the outdoor performance space, and then the other areas. So this is the notional animation of how that worked. Cut the two ends off, elevate, and then bridge. And then the basic components are there. So one of the things that this third component is a stage. And the stage in this position is for the 14,000 event, but it's proposed as a robotic stage that actually runs across the site and connects to two different places to the other elements. One of the things that was very clear in the competition too is that of course people will go and visit this complex, but it also had to be something that would be immediately recognizable, again a kind of icon that would be used in the media. And so the buildings were designed with that in mind. And so this issue of the icon and changeability was really important. So this was one of the arguments in the competition, that we didn't want a fixed icon like Bob Costas, but that kind of Madonna model was much more appropriate, that she was always the same but always different. And the issue of the flexibility was also a very important one for the urban operation of the project. So yes, for the large concert of 14,000 people, the stage would be at the far end of the site and essentially close off the site. But then if the stage moved, in its wake, you could have a completely open and free sort of event park. And then when the stage went all the way over and essentially kissed the cube of the Hall of Fame, it became completely open park space. So this is a kind of view from the main auditorium looking at the robot stage as it's parked in front of the main hall. This was an early rendering, again, of the open 14,000 person venue, and we were proposing at that point a median net that provided some shade but could also be illuminated and so forth. So you'll see that in an animation shortly. And then this is another modality for when it's an open park. This is a view from the Hall of Fame cube. That kind of eroded face has seating for 450 people, so you get a very intimate performance space and scale. We were really trying to work through the various permutations of scales of performances and types. So this would most likely be more of an acoustical performance, not an amplified one. We ultimately ran into real trouble with amplified sound in the open space, so I'll show you where the project is now. But this is the view during the competition. You can look out over that completely open space from the cube. And yeah, we worked through the sight lines that would be possible given proximity of the stage. Again, at this point, and actually that is returned, is that this would have to be a kind of hybrid theater that could handle both pop acts, but also Broadway shows and all kinds of other theatrical events. That was taken out of the project, and now, at this point, it's back in again. So it's an ongoing process. I think I hit the wrong button then, so it doesn't have to help me out. The end. Yeah, this is good. Yeah, this is fine. Thank you. And then this is one of the vertical spaces in the office tower that's above the atrium space, above the theater. So it's really a kind of thick, elevated ground plane that would actually be occupied with shopping and have all kinds of functions within the thickness of that elevated ground. So this is the latest iteration, kind of quick rendering. But we've been, basically, we have to enclose the outdoor space entirely because they want, the sound, the codes in Taipei are so stringent that they require library level sound around all the buildings, which is somewhat absurd because the noise of the trucks and cars are actually much louder than their sound code. But now this is the battle we're facing now. But anyway, the outdoor space is now an enclosed space, and we're making the end of the space modifiable, so it can be opened up and then closed for performance. But the idea still of keeping the public space open remains. So one can walk or use this vast shed for activities other than concerts. It's now got a kind of hippodrome form with a cantilevering balcony and a U-shaped audience, but the central area is essentially just a series of gentle flat plateaus that allow you to go and walk through the building to use this as a kind of enclosed and outdoor park space. This is the animation, competition level. I don't know if we have sound. We'll get a silent and spare. one about a year ago, and the project was moving very rapidly. We're already into detailed design in this project. And it was also a project that was motivated by the government to try to deal with what one could say the post-industrial situation of this port city. It's not going to be completely taken over by other uses. The industry won't go away. But it was more a matter of trying to deal at the planning level with keeping the port active while at the same time bringing the public in and having waterfront uses be really viable in the city. And so one of the things that the planning scale that we argued, because we had to produce a master plan as well as a piece of architecture, that the 2D zoning basically was holding back the way you could reconceive the use of the site, because it basically only dealt with programs on a plane. So what we proposed as an edge condition was to sandwich the uses. So the kind of industrial uses, the service functions would happen as they do now at grade. The specific architecture of the terminal would happen in between, and then there would be yet another level which would be open to the general public. So that was the very basic surface notion of the project. And that's really what we carried through kind of at all levels. So the idea is not to mix all of those realms together. They would be kept very distinct because they shouldn't be mixed. And because you're dealing in a way with a situation very much like an airport, where there are clean zones and then public zones. So the general public is above on a kind of esplanade. The functions of the terminal happen in between, and then the port uses happen down below. And that model then, in our proposition, gets extended along the entire waterfront and would house different programs, and they would engage the different strata in their own ways, and also connect back to the city. And the building itself doesn't simply sit on that promenade podium, but actually kind of lies astride it and connects to the various functions that the building has to do at each level. On the main level plan, there are very direct routes to the cruise ships that use this terminal and fast ferries. So there's a three-lobed form, and then the fourth lobe is actually the tower for the Port Authority. So that's sort of the center of the Port Authority in Kaohsiung. We'll move to this location. But it's all appended to this long boardwalk structure. And we worked with Poche in the plan, basically to put all of the vertical circulation into the space between the walls to keep the basic spaces pretty clear. So it is an evolution, I would say, from the ideas we were working through in the Pop Music Center. Although the kind of functions are almost the complete opposite. This is kind of centripetal project, the other one kind of centrifugal, everything goes to the center. This is a distributor. And it was very important to kind of open up each of the lobes down below to kind of create openings to the water and to feed the boardwalk into the terminal at a certain level so that you could look down into the goings-on in the terminal, yet not be directly involved with the terminal uses. Another issue that was raised in the competition was the fact that these cruise ships are really periodic visitors, and so for a large part of the time they expect this place to be pretty quiet. So we had to come up with a scheme also for distributing programs and uses around the terminal that would keep it active. And the idea really was to, that with the introduction of the elevated boardwalk, the general public could connect into levels of the terminal and even use certain parts of the terminal that wouldn't be used, like the waiting areas, for other kinds of functions, other kinds of events. But it was a project that was very figural, not a kind of open gridded terminal plan, but a really directed set of spaces, almost like a carburetor or a distributor that would shunt people to the boats or to the land. And so there also, kind of beyond that, the idea that, like in an airport, it was a bi-level sort of section. Departing passengers would stay on level right to the boats. Those disembarking would go down a level for pickup. And then you would always, because the spaces were kept pretty clear, have a glimpse of what's going on in the elevated boardwalk. And if you had the time, you could go up to that level and go to the restaurants or go to the shops that would be at the boardwalk level. This is a very early kind of rendering of the wall section. It's developed a lot more now. But the idea of kind of using that in-between space, that crochet space, both for the lighting and also for the circulation. And this was the structural concept, which is still substantially there, where there was a kind of diagrid for the tower. It's one continuous structure. There are no breaks. It behaves that way, which is very good, apparently, in the seismic area. And there are a series of large, like bridge trusses that hold the lobes, structure the lobes, and they connect to that diagram in the tower. And so the building really breaks up from the water, becomes more a series of objects, and then from the land side appears much more continuous. So I'll close now with a short animation.
Questions for Jesse? Nice crowd. Yep.
Well, I guess this is more of like, so I thought your talk was really interesting, and I thought it was really interesting with you talking about kind of the state of the rendering, how it resembles so much what the actual outcome is. And you also talked about having the scale become unreadable and having kind of like a service to unreadable scale and that kind of stuff. And but the most interesting slide to me in this whole talk was the one that showed the concrete of the building actually being built. And the foam things that you saw in the beginning of the what they were, and then we saw them that were stuck in the windows. And so that's actually really interesting because you actually understand from that point the scale and how they're built. Because I was wondering from the beginning, like, what kind of, you use concrete for that facade, but I'm wondering if you took any consideration into, during the design process, what you wanted out of that concrete, whether or not it was like an architectural kind of concrete that you were aiming for, because you painted it white and burning, and to make it readable, like the little distortions in the concrete, or the lip lines and stuff like that. And I just think that's really interesting because you're coming from an extreme. Like one is like the animations where you don't know how things are working. There's a little pavilion that's moving back and forth. I don't know how that's working. And then you show like the kind of really technical stuff and like the concrete. So I'm asking you like how much say and development went into the concrete. I know you wanted it to be like very high performance.
Right.
But yeah.
No, I mean there were. We took on a specialist in concrete named Reg Huff, and originally wanted to do 014 fair-face concrete, which means that we wouldn't have to paint, that it would be all white all the way through. The contractor absolutely refused to do it because he would have to make absolutely perfect pours, and you can't correct fair-face concrete. It can't be patched. You'll always see a patch. And which might be acceptable in places other than Dubai, but culturally they don't like seeing any imperfection at all. They want things to be absolutely as perfect as they can get it. So the contractor defaulted to standard concrete, and there was a lot of work done. There were in the initial pours, the formwork actually got squeezed and collapsed. The foam wasn't strong enough to carry the kind of the pressure of the concrete. So there were, in the first stories, the openings had to be ground back to the original shape. Then they put melamine laminate, which solved that problem, strapping around the foam, and that hardened it enough to take the pressure. But no, the whole discussion about the concrete the appearance of the concert was really important. And I was very, I guess probably because trained as a modernist at Cooper Union, I was really reluctant to have it painted. But at the end of the day, actually pretty pleased with what kind of came about. And now, of course, it's aging rapidly. It's got a lot of dust all over it, so it's producing another kind of effect, which is really interesting. Yes?
I was wondering if you could share with yourself, Caitlin, Kevin, and most of you, what you guys had initially envisioned when you formed the Atlas Architects, and also when you guys were
Oh,
forming.
you'd have to stand up here, Greg, and talk about it.
And also when you were forming the non-for-profit
Well, I mean, I think, from our point of view, and I think we were the only authentic team. I think we were generationally involved in a common project and still are. So I think, there was a natural kind of fit in terms of attitude, and it wasn't a forced marriage. It wasn't the easiest process for us. Others, everybody had a different experience, but I would say that, it was almost a natural thing to do. It was not something that anyone by themselves would have gone into, I think. And it was, there just seemed a certain rightness in getting together and doing it. So, I think there's still a history that's ongoing with all of us, and Jeff Kipnis will be doing a major exhibition at some point that kind of records, the common project, the similarities and the differences. But, in terms of that, it's clear. We all competed on the same competitions that Neil talked about at Columbia. It was a really exciting time. I don't know if that's an answer to your question. But yeah.
So, it's about aesthetics. Good call on the Miles Davis music at the end.
I can't take credit for that.
Oh, you
very
can't?
talented.
I'm so disappointed.
Yeah, no, I cannot.
And,
I honestly cannot.
Well, then you may not know.
I know it was the most controversial music that he ever produced, but
maybe, but
everybody.
you may know that Miles famously said, "I'll play it first and tell you what it means later." You showed the distinctions in the Campagnolo pieces, and I guess this is a little bit of a challenge because when you start getting projects and the lecture turns into a description of the deployment of the program, et cetera, are we to sort of say, this is what the aesthetics are, but like Miles, I'm not going to talk about it, I'm going to just let it be, and you take it, and meanwhile I'm going to make a technical discourse? Because we know that's what happens, and Tom always says, don't talk about the architecture, just talk about what you did to fix things and kind of make things.
Right.
But in Kaohsiung, would you say that the program generated the precise language of the building? Okay, so let's just open up a little bit about that.
Sure. No, I don't even know if I've become clean about that, but I mean, I think the program
I
could
think for
work
the
in that
students,
form.
I think for the students, it's a burning question.
There's no one-to-one relationship between.
Right.
So there could be a banal airport scheme that does all the things that does in terms of pure relationships, adjacencies, and the bubble diagram.
So
Sure.
the aesthetic project goes back to this is what we're working on, it's fluid, it continues from project to project. There are problems and issues, but they're not deterministic, they're cultural and...
Right, I mean, I think it's a difficult territory because obviously it's not dysfunctional either. It would have a certain, it works as well as it can. But I think, and of course there are other criteria for how something functions. Yeah. All the diagrams.
Anybody else?
Ray, you
Any
want to say
questions?
something? You look like you're...
No, I get two questions.
Yeah.
I don't know if they were right. I wondered, one,
Yeah.
what's the status of psychology?
Mm-hmm.
Only because you've been chasing the food from ever since I've done it.
Yes.
So, but it's, I don't think it's a technology.
Mm.
And maybe it's, I also think it's probably related to Uber and transit with some kind of
Totem.
I wondered about that, and I also
Yes.
wondered about the role of, just also because I know these are so long,
Yeah.
digital models and drawings, and
Yes.
wax sheets and things like that,
Uh-huh.
and how, if that stuff is still alive, or if you feel like that stuff has been integrated into the
It's still alive in our office. But it really depends on the project, I would say. Like the airport it was mainly done completely with the computer. But then the Pop Music Center, there were 15 models, physical models. That, I think, has to do with this problem that we have with the perspective window that I brought out. I mean, that judging very subtle differences, and this is a sculptural problem. It's very hard to make a judgment about whether you're going right or wrong through the perspective window of the computer. So actually, we worked a lot in 2D. I always insist that every projection in some way gets resolved as a purely 2D measurable condition. And then you just need to do a lot of them. In terms of adjustment, I mean, these are like really subtle things, but because it's almost impossible to kind of make those decisions in something that proclaims itself as being fully spatial, but it's actually, I don't know, metrically distorted. And you get, output that's shocking. It just isn't what you thought it was. I don't know if that's been your experience, but it's a concrete problem for us. I mean, so it means you can't rely on one plan, though. You'd have to rely on many, many 2D evaluations, which the computer would do to make those kinds of adjustments.
Because I think the unrolled things, the projected things, I mean, from what I know about your method in particular, is that a model building technique and then provoke a drawing technique, and then have to provoke a new model building technique.
Right.
And one of the problems with the computer is you think that the 3D model
Yes.
is the database you're going to make all your plans and sections from.
Right.
Plans and sections become just rows.
Right. Right.
A medium.
Yeah.
So I just wondered how multimedia you feel like you're still working either within the computer or with all the stuff that gets outputted into the computer.
No, I mean, it really, I guess it depends on the situation. Like the airport, with the exception of the main terminal, but the bolts, the barrel bolts are pretty knowable, and their extrusions are not changing that much. But we still, nevertheless, rely on looking at the 3D model in very conventional ways, I guess. Like, I want to see the pure plan. I don't want to see, I don't care about the fly-throughs at all. And, those are propaganda. Those are byproducts. They're not really helpful in the design work. I mean, that's the office attitude. So it's very old-fashioned. Yeah. On typology. Oh.
I wonder how you would be able to use those kinds of analyses retroactively, let's say, from the other two projects you showed, when it's very hard for me to think immediately of what you might be able to use to do that. Maybe like
Precedents for that?
Melnikov. Yeah.
The theater in
Yeah.
in Moscow.
Right.
And then there's also the Lawyers Theater. It wasn't open, but it was, yeah.
Are those, I guess the question is, are those as instrumental for you in making decisions about those projects as maybe retroactively having read your own power in relationship to the right power? Like now, when you describe it and think about it,
Yeah.
you think about it like that.
I can answer that.
I'm curious because of the kind of
Yeah.
psychological question. When you think of your project within the kind of psychological frame, those are very forms of psychological.
Yeah, they're more like, they probably belong, I don't even know if that's typology, but like object types. I mean, they could connect Corbu in that respect, obsessive interest in homes, objects, airplanes, bicycle parts, but they're not really connected to bona fide architectural typologies, historical typologies. Although they can be mixed. Probably that's what happens. I mean, I don't really think of it that way. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. And that was Hejduk's project. I mean, Hejduk's project was actually in some level, was to extract all of the figural elements of Corbu and kind of get rid of the domino grid and just focus in at some level, on that stuff. Or, not generalizing.
But it also had the allegorical stuff that actually figured well outside.
Yes, and I don't know. Yes and no. I don't know. Mixed purism and with.
Any other questions?
Judging from the projects that we've seen today, they have a very strong role in terms of design here, and I think it's been a very appropriate for the students to design for that Taipei and provide rapid expanding on both hopefully as well. They're very, they look solid. I'm just wondering if your firm would look at the project the same way, if they're designing something, for example, here in downtown LA, if we're doing an infill project or something that's a little bit different in terms of design types of the city, or in terms of culture, anything different that you would do.
I mean, I think part of the thrust of the work, though, is to not really to change it, but there would be another way of dealing with a response to the context, I suppose. If it is typological, I mean, it's infill, row houses, I mean, it would be an interesting problem to take that on.
Last question?
About what?
Like things like panopticon, yeah, I mean, let's say like.
Oh, we had a lot of panopticon.
Yeah, let's say for the generation before you, things were kind of quite rigid, whereas the generation after you, they operate in quite loose environment. I'm wondering how you see your work in that way. And this is the second one, probably
aura.
Yeah, like how you feel like you're
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think that was explicit. I mean, that was something that was really interesting to explore in Oklahoma. Yeah. Both the issue of the aura and the determined aura. The new situation where the aura is not tied to mountains anymore or original works. It's somehow come up. And I think it's not just us. I think that's part of what's happening. As to the question of generations, I mean, I think we were trained, my personal training was kind of both the kind of neo-avant-garde work of people like Hejduk and Slutsky, and then a pretty big dose of postmodernism, too. And so I think generationally we reacted in various ways, but we were also pretty aware of, we were still getting some history. And I think that does, I hope, inform what we do. I mean, Greg would have an interesting thing to say about his experience at Princeton, working with all of the postmodernists and what that means. And whether we are doing postmodernism, maybe we are.
So that's going to be the last word.
Maybe I